Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin McCumber, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the MIT Alumni Sonoma Wine Masterclass, featuring the wines and founder of Dry Creek Vineyard from Sonoma, California. Like I said, my name is Kevin. I'm an MIT alum, class of 2005 undergraduate and 2011 PhD. And I run food and beverage events through the MIT Club of Boston, now virtually for all MIT alumni. And I'd like to thank the MIT Club of Boston for continuing to support these events, as well as the MIT Alumni Association and the other MIT alumni clubs across the country who have helped to get the word out about our events. And I know a lot of you are joining from outside the Boston area, so you're very much welcome, and we're thrilled to have you. I'd also like to thank our presenters for the evening. From Dry Creek Vineyard, Dave Stair and his daughter Kim Stair Wallace, as well as Sarah Rathbun from Dry Creek, who has been instrumental in making sure that we get a kit available for folks and making sure that all the logistics with that go smoothly. So thank you all. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. And finally, I'd like to thank all the alumni and friends of MIT who are joining tonight. Many of you have joined a lot of our events in this series and have been very supportive. Thank you for that. I really appreciate all the emails of support that you send. And I also appreciate all the donations that I know many of you have generously given in support of MIT's COVID-19 response funds. Our past two events, we just started getting some data as far as aggregate donations, and we were averaging a little over $7,000 per event just in donations. So, that's going a long way to helping MIT combat the negative effects of the pandemic. All right, I'm just going to quickly go over the agenda. This introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the event will work, and then I'll hand it over to Dave and Kim, who will do a toast, and then dive into their presentation about Sonoma as well as their wines. And that will include the tasting and a moderated Q&A session with them. And then we'll conclude the evening with breakouts. And if you're not familiar with breakouts on Zoom, these are virtual rooms of 5 to 6 people per room, where we just get together and chat for about 15 minutes. You can talk about the wine that you're tasting. You can talk about your time at MIT, whatever you like. It's our chance to get to know each other on a personal level and meet some of the folks that we wouldn't have met otherwise. And then no tasting is complete without an after party. So after the 9 o'clock Eastern end time, Dave is able to stay for a while afterwards. We'll all be able to unmute ourselves and chat with Dave a little bit about his wine and about MIT and whatever we'd like to talk about. Yes, the event is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the MIT Club of Boston's YouTube channel. I'll send out the link to that video, as well as some other things that I'll mention in a minute, in a post-event email that will come out next week. And as many of you know, this event is free to attend, but we do ask that you consider giving to MIT's COVID-19 response funds in an amount of your choosing to help MIT combat the pandemic. If you'd like to ask a question tonight, we're again using a portal for your questions. You can go to meet.ps/MITwine, and I'll put that link in the chat so you'll have that handy as well. If you go to meet.ps/MITwine, you can submit your question there, and you can also upvote other people's questions. And then I'll go through and cherry pick those questions for Dave and Kim as we go along this evening, and I'll also pose some more to them during the open moderated Q&A session near the end of the event. This event is one in a series of events focusing on food and beverage. And we have a pretty exciting lineup, I think, coming up. Next month, 4 weeks from today, March 26th, we'll be doing Sake 101. I'm very excited about this. We just opened registration. We have over 200 people registered already. This will be featuring Todd Bellamy, who's working on founding yet another sake brewery in the United States around here in the Boston area. April 30th, Kentucky Derby Day, we'll be doing bourbon with Nick Taylor from Taylor & Taylor Whiskey Company. On June 11th, we'll be doing a gin event featuring gin from Japan. And on July 22nd, we'll be doing a tea appreciation event with Mike Harney from Harney & Sons Teas. Then finally in September on the 17th, we'll be doing a mead tasting, mead being a wine fermented from honey. We'll also be tasting an array of honeys as part of that event, so it will be very interesting. There's still more events to come after that. I'll send out a post-event survey, and one of the questions there is what types of events you'd like to see. I do use that to spark some ideas for future events, so please fill that out, and also please reach out to me if you have any connections or suggestions for people that I should reach out to who might make good hosts for future events. And finally, if you'd like to stay in touch, I'll be sending these out in the post-event email as well. We have an email list that's dedicated to food and beverage events. You can join that. And we also have now the MIT Alumni Fine Spirit Society on Facebook that has over 210 people as members of it already, and that's growing pretty quickly. We get a lot of good discussion out there about food, wine, spirits, and even just some general interest things. So please consider joining that as well. All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce Dave Stair, MIT class of 62, course 1, environmental engineering, and his daughter, Kim Stair Wallace, who is now running Dry Creek Vineyard, which Dave founded. I actually got to know Dave about 7 years ago through a family connection who knew him. And we've been in touch a little bit ever since. And so it's great that finally we get to put on an event together. So Dave and Kim, thank you so much. It's great to have you here, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
It's nice to be here.
Very nice. It sounds like you have a very fun, active alumni group. I decided I want to join at least 2 of those other tastings.
Although I must admit, it appears that the emphasis is on wine and beverages rather than food, based upon your lineup for the next 5 months.
Well, it's different a little bit by personal interest, yeah.
Yeah, good.
Well, Dad, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me give you a little bit about my history. I was raised in the Boston area. My dad was a professor at Harvard University School of Public Health, and I went to high school, and I actually went to Phillips Academy in Andover, and then in looking around for colleges, I applied for 3: Princeton, RPI, and MIT, and I wanted to really go to Princeton, but I got turned down there, so I went to my second choice, which was MIT, and as it turned out, it was probably a great choice. Anyways, I was a freshman at MIT the fall of '58, and studied civil engineering, which was it was mainly civil engineering. I think the environmental sciences name wasn't adopted until a number of years later. But that's a picture of me from my yearbook in 1962. Unfortunately, our house burned down in the fires 3 years ago in the wine country fires. And I lost all my MIT paraphernalia, including my yearbook. So it's nice to see that picture. Anyways, after MIT, I got my MBA from Northwestern. And my first love in life had always been railroads. I've been a railroad buff, I still am. And summers at MIT, I worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And then at Northwestern, after 2 years of getting my MBA, I ended up getting a job with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and living in Baltimore, Maryland. That's where Kim was. Kim was actually born in Chicago, but had spent her first 2 or 3 years in Baltimore. While living in Baltimore, I got to know a man by the name of Philip Wagner, who had been a newspaper reporter for the Baltimore Sun, but he'd also started a small Maryland winery called Bordy Vineyards. And I got to know Philip and actually planted in my backyard about 40 French-American hybrid grapevines and made a couple of years of what turned out to be absolutely horrible wine. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had a lot of fun. And after 3.5 years of the railroad, I began to, both my wife and I wanted to live overseas. And basically I was able to get a job in Germany after we studied German for 2 years at Johns Hopkins University Night School. And after a couple of years of studying German, I was able to get a job in Germany, right on the Rhine River in the small town of Neuwied am Rhein, which is about an hour's drive south of Cologne, Germany. And we lived there for 2 years. While in Germany, many weekends were spent driving up and down the Rhine and the Moselle, and we made trips over to the Champagne region of France and to Burgundy. but I became very interested in wines as a hobby. My boss was a German wine aficionado, and wines became a major hobby of mine. I returned from Germany in essentially May of '67, and that summer I took a course in wine appreciation from the Boston Center for Adult Education. The fellow who taught the course became a good friend of mine, Fred Eck, who was a Harvard grad, but he at that time was working, he had helped found a small wine wholesaler called Classic Wine Imports in Boston. And through that friendship with Fred, I began to develop an interest in getting into the wine business. In June of 1970, I took a 2.5-week vacation to France and spent virtually all the time in Burgundy, Bordeaux, and the Loire Valley. And while there, I came up with a scatterbrained idea that what I really wanted to do for the rest of my life was somehow move back to France and get into the wine business. Well, fortunately for me and for France, just after coming back from that trip, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about what a great future California had for becoming a world-class wine growing area. As a result of that article, I forgot about France and turned my eyes towards California. One of my best friends when I was at Andover was a young lawyer in San Francisco, and I called my friend Steven Adams up, and I asked, Steve, what do you know about the wine business? He said, not much, but I've got some friends involved in it. Well, November of 1970, I made my first trip to California and spent about 2 weeks out here and decided we were going to move out to California. And I went back home and told my wife and kids we were moving to California. They really had no say-so in the matter. And we moved out here in essentially August of '71. On one of my following trips to California before moving out here, I went to a week-long course at UC Davis and realized I better go back to school if I was going to learn something about the wine business. So I enrolled as a special graduate student at UC Davis, studying coursework only. It's interesting, the graduate advisor there, Dr. Singleton, and looking at my transcripts from MIT said, Dave, you're a little bit weak in chemistry. I'd suggest taking a course in organic chemistry before moving to California. So the summer of '71, I took an organic chemistry course at Boston University. It was the hardest course I've ever had in my life. Driving into BU, I was living in Wellesley at the time, every day from class from 8:30 to noontime, then labs 4 afternoons a week. BU was unair conditioned at the time. It was hotter than hell, and it was a very tough course, but I passed it. And then, anyways, we moved out to California in August of '71, spent a year at UC Davis studying enology and viticulture. And while at Davis, besides obviously studying, a lot of my free time was spent driving around Sonoma, Napa, and Mendocino, and Livermore, and a little bit down in Monterey, the traditional coastal wine growing regions of California, looking at property, looking for ways to get into the business. And then fairly soon in this look for property, it became evident that northern Sonoma County was the place to look hardest, mainly because Sonoma County had a history of grape growing going back well over 100 years, and at that time was pretty much still undiscovered. Most of the wineries that were in existence at that time were founded by second and third generation Italian immigrants, and they were they were basically making country red and country white wine. Very little emphasis was being made for varietals. And whoops, I just lost my picture. Oh, there's okay. That's moving on a little bit. I bought a rundown 70-acre prune ranch in the Dry Creek Valley of Sonoma County. Sonoma County is about 65 miles north of San Francisco, and Dry Creek is one of the 4 main viticulture areas in Sonoma County. The other ones being Alexander Valley, Russian River Valley, or Valley of the Moon. And anyways, Dry Creek is a narrow valley about, well, viticulturally speaking, probably 2 miles wide and probably 15 miles long, essentially northwest of the town of Healdsburg. We're about 20 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean, and as I said, about 60 miles north of San Francisco. But this is the property that we initially bought. That's our groundbreaking ceremony, which I think was, to build the winery, was actually in May of '73. Now, we actually made our first wines in 72, not at Dry Creek, but over at Cuvée. One of my friends that I made when I moved out here was a man by the name of Tom Cottrell, who had founded Cuvée Winery a few years before we came on the scene. And we became friends, and I was able to set up 4 fermentation tanks and a wine press over at Cuvée. And it's interesting that 3 other wineries crushed at Cuvée there, ourselves, Clos de Val, which was started by Bernard Portet, a Frenchman, and Spring Mountain Cellars made their wines there that year. But in the spring of 73, we were able to start construction of our own winery here in Dry Creek Valley. There it is. And since 73, virtually everything has been done at Dry Creek. Our initial production was about 1,300 cases, about 500 cases of Chenin Blanc, about 500 cases of a Sauvignon Blanc, which we called Fumé Blanc, and about 300 cases of Chardonnay. One of the, I think, best things that happened to us earlier is that the predominant Northern California wine writer at the time was a man by the name of Robert Finnegan. He used to publish his Private Guide to Wines, and I had somehow gotten to know Robert, and I sent Bob one of our first release of Chenin Blanc in about April, and in his May or June newsletter, he reviewed it as the best Chenin Blanc in California. Needless to say, we sold out of that wine within a couple of weeks. Our next release was our Fumé Blanc, or dry Sauvignon Blanc. And again, he raved about that wine as being probably the best Fumé Blanc from 72. And that kind of put us on the wine map. He never really talked much about our Chardonnay, which I thought was pretty nice too. But anyways, in 73, we moved the production over to the winery, which you saw a picture being of the initial building being built. And in 73, added reds. We were going to make red in 72, but we had ideal harvest conditions up until, I think, roughly about October 1st. And then beginning in early October, we had about 15 days of solid rain. Well, the rain essentially pretty much watered down and ruined the red grapes, and we ended up not picking the grapes or rejecting the grapes that we had under contract for Cabernet that year. So we made no red wine in 72. In 73, we did the same 3 whites, Chenin, Fumé, and Chardonnay, and added reds, basically Cabernet, Zinfandel. I think we did a little bit of Merlot that year. But that was the initial production of the winery. I will tell you kind of a funny story. The house that I had bought to live in Healdsburg was on West Dry Creek Road, which is the western side of Dry Creek Valley. And I originally wanted to build the winery up at the house, kind of the foothills of West Dry Creek Road. And my neighbors got up a petition opposing the winery. And I went around and got my neighbors to sign a petition in favor of the winery. And I think half of my signatures were the same as the opponents' guys. But the planning department gave us a unanimous use permit, or unanimous approval of a use permit. That's when the neighbors appealed. They appealed to the Board of Supervisors, and 3 days before the hearing, I got a call from our local supervisor, a fellow by the name of Hank Spomer, who had been a tractor salesman for many years. And Hank said, "Dave, can you come down and see me?" So I went down and saw him, and he said, "Dave, you've created quite a ruckus in Dry Creek Valley." He said, "You got the property, you own the property at the corner of Lambert Bridge and Dry Creek Road?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Well, we're going to deny you the permit at your house, but you can build anything you want at that other location." And he said, "Believe me, it's a much better location for a winery." Excuse me. Well, as it turned out, it's true. We have the best location in Dry Creek Valley. And in a way, I'm so glad my neighbors opposed the building of the winery up at my house. Since then, there have been a number of wineries built on West Dry Creek Road, but it's still the same narrow, windy road. And it's kind of a traffic mess over there in the weekends. Anyways, that's the early history of the winery. So I did not grow up in a wine producing family. And it's funny, my first year of 73 here, I essentially was making wines with the textbook, and I had hired a friend of mine, Fred Brander, who started a winery called Brander Cellars down in Santa Barbara area. And Fred was kind of a consultant and kind of helped me and told me what to do. And then the following year we hired Tom Dalinger, who started Dalinger Winery, and he was kind of our consultant for a few months. And there's a picture of me checking the sugar content of our grapes. Very primitive. We were a pretty primitive winery at the time, but we added reds in '73. There's a picture of me. We were draining. I'm not sure whether it's Cabernet or Zinfandel, but it's obviously red grapes. Getting in the tank, cleaning it out. But we added reds in '73, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, our initial production was about 1,300 cases. In '73, we made about 6,000, and then we grew gradually every year up to about the year 2000, when we produced about 140,000 cases of wine. Since then, we've shrunk somewhat, and we're now producing about 100,000 cases a year, concentrating primarily on 5 varietals. Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc are our 2 principal whites. We still make a little bit of Chardonnay. And our reds are primarily Cabernet and Zinfandel, and a little bit of Petit Syrah, a little bit of Petit Syrah, and a little bit of Pinot Noir. But those 5 varieties, the Cabernet, Merlot, Zinfandel, and Chenin and Fumé are our principal wines. I'm often asked, why do you call the wine Fumé Blanc? Well, basically because it sells. I recall having dinner or lunch in sometime in the winter of '71-2 with Barney Fetzer, who started Fetzer Winery. And I said, Barney, why do you call your Sauvignon Blanc Fumé Blanc? And he said, Dave, it sells. And he told me a story that one year they were bottling Sauvignon Blanc. What was bottled before lunch, they put a label Fumé Blanc on it. What was bottled after lunch was labeled Sauvignon Blanc. Same wine, same bottle, same, identical in every way except the name and the label. And he said the Fumé Blanc outsold the Sauvignon Blanc 3-1. And then in some blind tasting, when tasters were presented with a glass of wine, which was Fumé, and a glass which is, and they were told that it was Fumé Blanc and a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, people preferred the Fumé Blanc 3-1. And so as a result, we decided to call our wine Fumé Blanc.
Well, with that, I'm going to jump in and interrupt you, because it occurs to me we completely forgot to give a toast, and I bet everybody's very thirsty. I know I am getting thirsty. So this is first of all, permission to start your drinking. And let's just raise a toast. First of all, I love hearing Dad's story. I've heard it 100 times, maybe 1,000 times in my life, but I always love hearing it. And, just the passion and really it's sort of that American dream come true, So cheers to you, Dad, and cheers to everybody who joined us tonight. We really, really, really appreciate it. So cheers.
You don't want to hear me talk about wine. You want to taste it first too. Anyways, cheers.
Well, maybe if I can, Dad, maybe I'll just segue a little bit to kind of where we are today with the winery, and then we can talk about the wines. Does that sound good, Kevin?
Sure. Yeah.
So one thing Dad forgot to mention, which I think is kind of obvious, but maybe it didn't come through. He was the first winemaker here in Dry Creek Valley after Prohibition. So his arrival and buying this really rundown 55-acre prune orchard was a big deal. I mean, it really shook things up. The locals were not exactly welcoming, and he was looked upon as a true renegade. And in fact, I think when he wanted to plant Sauvignon Blanc, and he had fallen in love with Sauvignon Blanc in the Loire Valley, but when he wanted to plant it, the local farm advisor said, "Oh, that's a bad variety. Don't plant that." And I think
I forgot that when we bought the property here, I got the local farm advisor out, Dale Good, who was a well-known viticulturist at the time, a friend, and we dug some test holes in the vineyard, and Dale and I jumped down, and the farm advisor looked at the soil. They said, "Yep, looks like good vineyard dirt, good soil." And I said, what would you plant here? And they said, if you want to do a white, we do Riesling or Gewürztraminer.
Did
If you
they
want-
also suggest French Colombard?
No, he did not.
No?
And I think if you want to do red, I think we would do Napa Gamay or Gamay Beaujolais, two clones of essentially of Pinot Noir. Well, I said, what about Sauvignon Blanc? It's my favorite wine from France. And they said, no, Sauvignon Blanc doesn't grow very well in Sonoma County. Well, I went ahead and planted Sauvignon Blanc, and I think consistently over the last 49 years, Dry Creek Valley has emerged primarily as a Sauvignon, for white wines, primarily as a Sauvignon Blanc producing area. Besides ourselves, you've got Pedroncelli, you've got Preston, you've got a number of other good ones too.
Well, as you saw from that groundbreaking picture, when my parents moved here, I was 9 years old, and I literally grew up at the winery. Worked here as a teenager. Worked in a number of different jobs in the winery. Swore I'd never work here as a grown up, right? If any of you have ever worked in a family business, you know how that is. And I ended up coming back when I was in my mid-20s. And fell in love with it. And it was a, here I am. It's kind of a funny picture. The one on the left, I think I was about 13 years old, and that was in our old tasting room. And what I love about that picture, not only is the rotary phone on the wall, but right above my head, you can see the sailboat calendar. And I'll talk about the importance of sailboats in a moment. And then on the right is my husband and myself. And then in the bottom is my husband, Don, and my dad and I. So, literally grew up in this business and came back. Have held pretty much every job at the winery. And then when Dad retired, he actually retired in 2006. And we put in place a formal board of directors. By that time, my husband had actually joined the winery too. So we'd both been, we'd really learned from the ground up. And we'd both been here. And when we took over from Dad, things started to change a little bit. So one of the things, if you are familiar with the wine industry, one of the real tragedies, frankly, is that there are very few wineries like Dry Creek left that are, privately owned, legacy family-owned wineries that are still, producing world-class wines. Most of our colleagues and most of Dad's peers have all sold out. And so one of the things I became very concerned with, and this was right around the time my father was retiring and actually going into the late 2000s, is this increasing corporatization and consolidation of the California wine business. And we were beginning to see big changes ahead. And what my husband and I did is really, and Dad too, as a family, we really took a look at what we, wanted to do and how did we want to leave our mark. Dad was a tremendous pioneer in the industry. He championed the Sauvignon Blanc varietal. He championed the Dry Creek Valley region. Today there are almost 80 wineries in our tiny little valley when he was here first. But we had, in some ways, we had grown quite a bit. As Dad said, we had expanded our production quite a bit. And all of our wines were a Sonoma County appellated wine. And it was my general feeling that we wanted to go back to kind of the roots of the winery and start to refocus our efforts a bit on more of a Dry Creek Valley centric approach, if you will, producing wines that really reflect this unique and very special region. And so over the course of, many years, really literally the last 15 years, we've pretty much completely reinvented ourselves. My husband, Don, I call him the dirt guy. He was responsible and really has been the visionary behind many of our vineyard development projects. And certainly it does, you have to start with world-class grapes before you can make world-class wines. But we turned over every single stone and started to look at what we wanted to do. And so the wines we're tasting today are in large part a reflection of that. This Fumé Blanc, so let's just talk a little bit about the Fumé. As Dad was mentioning, this was, kind of his flagship. The arrival of Dry Creek Vineyard Fumé Blanc, not only did it put Dry Creek Vineyard on the map, it put Dry Creek Valley on the map. And his selection of the name Fumé Blanc was, I think, Dad, weren't you quite inspired by Robert Mondavi, who had coined the term 4 years prior?
Bob Mondavi in '68 was confronted with the problem of having a lot of very good dry Sauvignon Blanc, but had a hard time selling it. And so we came up with the term Fumé Blanc, which is the French word for Sauvignon Blanc, or a French synonym. And his sales took off like a wildfire. And that's kind of, I guess, what Barney Fetzer told me too.
Right. And and in all honesty, today the term Fumé Blanc, it's a little bit maybe old-fashioned. It can be very confusing for people. You don't see a lot of new wineries using the term Fumé Blanc. But in our case, Fumé Blanc absolutely honors the legacy of Dad's, early days. And it is also a nod to sort of the style of wines in the Loire Valley that we love, which is Puy-Fumé and that region. So this particular vintage, this is the 2019 vintage. I think this is quintessentially Dry Creek Fumé Blanc as it gets. And I have never mastered sipping, swirling, and talking at the same time. I do not recommend it. So I have to just take a little pause. So one of the things with our Fumé Blanc that we really celebrate is kind of the natural, somewhat assertive side of Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc, depending on how it's farmed and where it's grown and all of that, can express different ways. It can be extremely aggressive, and it can be extremely fruity. And ours is sort of maybe in the middle, just to the left. So we really champion the sort of bright, tart, crisp, citrusy elements. There's a little bit of a kind of a fresh grapefruit, lemongrass, aromatic. I don't know if any of you are smelling what I'm smelling. Sometimes I even sense some of the dried herbs that you would find in a bouquet garni. So, tarragon and thyme and some of those lovely dried herbs that you cook with. But it's got great acidity. 2019.
I think a lot of people kind of consider our style of Sauvignon Blanc to be very New Zealand-like in style, which is, again, somewhat more aggressive, herbaceous, not oak aged.
But it's important that, we don't want it to be too herbaceous. That's not really our style either. We want that nice bright fruit to come through. So this is a wine that and there's many different ways you can make Sauvignon Blanc, and we make several different styles. We actually make 4 different Sauvignon Blancs. This is the one that's stainless steel fermented, and it's not oak aged at all. And so a lot of times when people see the term Fumé Blanc on the label, they get a little confused because they think it means that it's oak aged. And in our case, it's not. In South Africa, if you drink South African wines, Fumé Blanc, you have to have it be aged in oak barrels. But our approach is a little bit more minimal. So it's stainless steel fermented at very cool temperatures. So we have those nice, bright, fresh fruit characteristics. We want it to be very vibrant and refreshing. In 2019, if I'm not mistaken, 2019, I think, was a little bit of a cooler year. So we had a little bit more natural acidity. As far as the grapes, this is a combination of our own estate-owned vineyards, meaning we grow the grapes ourselves and farm them, and growers' vineyards. We work with a lot of small local growers. So one of the things I probably should share is that in our transformation, sort of from the first generation to the second generation, we started to expand our own vineyard holdings here, primarily in Dry Creek Valley. And we today are about 185 acres of all 100% certified sustainable fruit. We are 100% certified sustainable, all of our vineyards and the business as well. But I really feel like this is such a quintessential Fumé Blanc. It hasn't changed in style really in almost 5 decades. Well, yeah, 5 decades, because this is our 49th anniversary. We're starting to put into preparation some plans for our 50th anniversary next year. And we are going to be kicking up our heels because COVID is going to be long gone, right? This is sort of a fun slide that shows the transition of our Fumé Blanc label from the early days, from our first vintage in 72 to where we actually need to update the slide, Sarah, and put the latest Fumé Blanc slide on there. But anyway, that's just a little bit about the style of the Fumé Blanc. I want to talk now a little bit about why we're so passionate about our region and Dry Creek Valley. And I'm sure many of you or some of you have probably been to California on a wine tasting trip, and quite likely you've been to Napa Valley. So Sonoma County is roughly 75 miles north of San Francisco. That's a great slide. So this kind of orients you. And of course, the state of California is huge, but we're about 70 miles north of San Francisco, and we're in the northern end of the county of the Sonoma. Now, Dad, you mentioned when you arrived, there were 4 main appellations here, and now there are 18 recognized AVAs or American viticultural appellations within the county of Sonoma. And you can see Dry Creek Valley is a kind of a smallish one just north of the town of Healdsburg. And sort of Dry Creek Valley and Alexander Valley come to a point, if you will, at the town of Healdsburg. Just now talking about Dry Creek Valley, it's small. It's 16 miles long by, maybe a mile. I think maybe a mile and a half at the widest. And it's quite unique. We're a warmish climate, but we're very influenced by the Pacific Ocean. So you can see we're really only 20 miles from the ocean as the crow flies. And the area east of us, which is Napa Valley, is quite a bit warmer. And it's not as impacted by the marine layer as we are. So in the summer months in particular, it's not uncommon to have the fog roll in, every day. Or every evening, I should say, and cool the grapes down. And then by, 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning, the fog will burn off and it'll get to be quite warm. It's in the, maybe low 90s, sometimes mid 90s in the summertime. Of course, we don't have the humidity that you do in Massachusetts, but it can be quite warm. But then again, that fog rolls in like clockwork. And so we will have easily a 30-degree shift in temperature every day. Well, grapes love that. We have, a very nice, long, warm growing season. We call it hang time, so nice, long hang time. But the grapes don't get overripe. And so the varietals that do well in Dry Creek Valley are the varietals that Dad just happened. I think it was probably, I would think you would say it was luck, right, Dad? Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet and Zinfandel, et cetera. Dry Creek Valley is a little too warm for really growing world-class Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and we do produce both of those varietals in very small quantities, but they are actually grown south of here in a cooler appellation called Russian River Valley. So we're really focused, though, on Dry Creek Valley, and that was something that Dawn and I felt really passionate about. And, it had been many decades of working with these vineyards and with these sites that kind of taught us that, hey, this is a region that's unlike any other in the state of California, and we needed to be Dry Creek Valley focused. So one of the other things that's unique about our region is the diversity of the topography. So this is a photograph that shows you how kind of rugged and mountainous the area is at the northern end of the valley. And we have vineyards that are fairly steep in elevation, very, very beautiful vineyards, all hand-picked. That's where we grow some of our Cabernet and actually some Zinfandel as well. And the soil on those vineyard sites tends to have a lot of iron, high iron content. So the soil is very bright red. And we had an inkling that our Cabernets would just do really well in that soil. So we started to plant more Cabernet in those types of, on those western slopes. We call them iron slopes on the western side of the valley. And this photograph, for example, shows, it's a little hard to see, but you can sort of imagine how red that soil is. Whereas on the eastern side of Dry Creek Valley, we have more of a decomposing sedimentary rock. It's kind of a fluffy, rocky soil and more of a benchland area. We have some very, very prized vineyards on the eastern bench as well that, kind of showcase a different expression in our red wines. Sarah, maybe you can show the slide that shows the three colors of dirt, because I think that's kind of interesting. And then, so if you're thinking of, imagine this long sort of narrow valley, 16 miles long, right? Half a mile to a mile wide. And right down the middle of the valley floor is a creek called Dry Creek, which isn't dry. It's actually a year-round river, but that's where Dad bought that 55-acre rundown prune orchard. So
it used to be dry, but
it used to be dry.
5 years ago, the Army Corps of Engineers finished a dam called Warm Springs Dam, about 10 miles north of the winery. So now the creek flows year round.
And I think when the original vineyard site that Dad, when he cleared the prune orchard and started to plant Sauvignon Blanc, it was in this very sandy, loamy, well-drained soil. And we still produce wine from that vineyard. It was our very first Sauvignon Blanc vineyard, and we call it DCV3. And it is right along the valley floor, kind of behind the winery. Like I said, I'm at the winery right here up on sort of a little bench. And I don't know if it was, your intelligence, Dad, or just stroke of luck, but he planted Sauvignon Blanc in that sandy, loamy soil. And, it's become a world-renowned vineyard. It was actually written up in a vineyard, in a book probably 5-6 years ago as one of the 40 great vineyards in the world. So that kind of shows you, this slide shows you sort of the diversity of these
I
three
would like to
soils.
say it was my intelligence, but it was mainly luck.
Well, we can give MIT credit, right? Intelligence, anyway.
Yeah.
And actually the other thing about Dry Creek Valley that I think is fascinating is, so when you arrived here, Dad, Dry Creek Valley was not a recognized appellation. It was an area, right? A region.
Yeah,
But
there were no appellations in California at that time smaller than an individual county, Sonoma County, Napa, Mendocino. And in the late 70s, there began to become a feeling in the industry that we had to have some sub-appellations because northern Sonoma County is different from southern Sonoma County. And as a result, you started to see the area develop in sub-appellations. The four initial ones were Dry Creek Valley, Alexander Valley, and Russian River Valley, which kind of radiate out from the town of Hillsborough, kind of like spokes in the wheel. Dry Creek is essentially northwest, Alexander Valley is north, and Russian River Valley is south to southeast, south to southwest. And then, of course, the fourth one being Valley of the Moon, or the Sonoma Valley, it's also called. Which
I think they just added Fort Ross. I think that was the last one. I think we're up to 18 now.
Yeah, could be, I don't know.
Anyway, let's see. So what else on Fumé Blanc? Do you have anything to add on the Fumé Blanc, Dad, or any questions that might have come up, Kevin?
Tastes great as always has.
Well, I tell you, it's one of the most versatile wines that we produce. And, I love this wine with a variety of, first of all, it's obviously great on a hot summer day, but it's terrific with oysters. And I know probably many of you are oyster lovers, and there's a competition. They haven't been doing it as of recently, but for many, 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 many years, we were picked as one of the top 10 best wines in the world for oysters. Both our dry Chenin Blanc, which is also delicious, and I would encourage you guys to taste that, but our Fumé Blanc. So it's great with oysters, really nice with, anything. I love it with chèvre or anything with a goat cheese. I love it, obviously, with any kind of fish, scallops. I was thinking about, since many of you, I think, are from Massachusetts, and when, so as Dad said, he grew up in Wellesley, and that's where my grandparents were. And I actually went to boarding school in Wellesley. And I remember my grandfather, he constantly was eating baked haddock. Baked haddock, that's like the signature fish of the state of Massachusetts. And there used to be a fish market in Wellesley called Captain Martin's. I don't know if it's still there, but
I think it is.
A lot of Fumé Blanc with haddock.
Tim, could I jump in with a few
Yes.
questions?
Sure.
I'm trying to pull ones that are relevant to the topic at hand, but when you flash those labels of the Fumé Blanc on the screen, we got a lot of questions about the boats.
Boats, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the sailboat motif and the boats on the labels? What's the story behind that, and how do you choose those?
Our initial label, we began to feel was dated in the early 80s. And sailing has always been kind of a family hobby. I owned for about 35 years, a 36-foot sailboat on San Francisco Bay. And one day while sailing, we started talking about maybe we ought to somehow incorporate a label, a sailboat on our label. So we hired a local graphic illustrator who came up with some sketches, and we decided we liked the sailboat theme, and that's how we stuck with it. Now, there's an interesting picture. One of our local university, Sonoma State University, used to have a sailing team. I'm not sure if they still have it, but they needed to raise some money to buy some new sailboats. And because of my love of sailing, we ended up giving them funds, I think, to buy two of these sailboats. I forget, it's a Flying Junior, I think, is the class. I'm not sure, I forget. But one of them was named Zinfandel. And it's interesting, the year that we gave the boats, one of their sailors was, what was Homburg's first name?
Peter.
Peter Homburg was a student at Sonoma State from St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands. And he went on to captain the Virgin Islands America's Cup entry 25 years ago. Unfortunately, they didn't make it to the finals, but he became, I think, on the winning boat, the tactician or one of the crew on the first boat that won the America's Cup. And I remember being in St. Thomas 30 years ago and going on a cruise, going sailing with Peter and his crew on the boat, which was their training boat in the harbor there. It was a lot of fun.
Well, and so that first sailboat label was 1982.
Yeah.
And so when I came back to work for the winery for Dad, one of the first things I did is start working on redesigning all the packaging, because I had come from a design background, and we've used every kind of medium: watercolors, oil paintings, you name it. Chalk. I don't even think we have the chalk. We had a series of labels that were very ugly that had pastels on them. But anyway, we've been known over the years as really the kind of the wine of sailors, wine for sailors. And so it's been really fun. When Sarah had that picture up of us at the America's Cup World Series races, the Louis Vuitton America's Cup World Series races, which we were the featured winery at in 2016. And that was a fun gig. You can see by the big smile on my face and those, handsome guys around me, which was Team Oracle Racing, which was, the preeminent team at the time, that I was enjoying that job. But my husband and I are avid sailors as well. And Dad has a summer cottage in Maine. And every summer for the first 2 weeks of August, we usually go to Maine to sail. And so we've just been heavily involved in sailing. It's really in our DNA. And it's probably the number one question that we get asked is, why is there a sailboat on a brand called Dry Creek? So anyway, but what else? Let's see. Well, what I want to talk, I guess, maybe a little bit about sustainability, unless you have some other questions, Kevin.
Let's go on, and we can toss another one in a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So as we started to, shift and shape the winery in our vision, sustainability became a very, very important factor, and it was something that my husband really was passionate about. And in fact, he was probably the first in our region to really develop the code of ethics for sustainable farming for our industry. So we're known as a leader in it. It's something I'm very proud of. We don't really talk about it a lot, but I think it's really interesting. I also think it's really confusing for people, because it's kind of a misused terminology, if you will. But for us, what it means is all kinds of things that we do around the winery. I mean, there's hundreds of things. And actually every year we have to get recertified. There's a workbook about 4 inches tall that every year we have to, each department head has to prove that we basically have to prove that we are improving. And so it becomes harder and harder to get recertified every single year. But this slide just shows a few of the things that are illustrative of our sustainable farming. So on the right is my husband, Dawn, and our dog Holly, and this is in one of the vineyards that we had left fallow in between replanting. And that's another thing, leaving the vineyard fallow after you replant, after you tear out a vineyard, and then planting cover crops in this case. This happens to be a hay crop, so we were growing hay and selling hay. But for anywhere from 3 to 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, we will leave that vineyard unplanted, so it's fallow, so that it naturally regenerates the soil. And that's a real important commitment. I mean, think about it. We're not making any we're not producing grapes from that vineyard, so we're not making any money. But it's a commitment to sustainability. We have a beautiful insectary garden here at the winery with over 100 different species of plants that are designed to attract beneficial insects. We keep bees on the property. We actually make our own honey now. We actually make our own honey, and we make our own olive oil from about 125 olive trees that line our driveway. We have raptor perches throughout the vineyards to attract birds of prey. All kinds of different things. We actually, the fish habitat restoration was a project that was kind of a passion project, where we partnered with the county of Sonoma for them to build fish-friendly habitat for spawning for steelhead trout and coho salmon. So these are just a few of the things we've done, and we continue to do them. And it's part of our attempt to really improve the land and hopefully have it be in better shape for the next generation. As a child, when I grew up here and when Dad moved here, somebody, when they were tearing out a vineyard, they would tear out the vineyard, blast the soil with chemicals, fumigate, right? Put the plastic tarp over it, and the very next year you'd plant. Well, years and years and years of doing that, was not necessarily good for the soil. And so we all know that biodiversity is very important. And so we're truly trying to promote that and do that and practice that. Anyway, that's enough about sustainability. Shall we get on to some of the Mariner?
Sure. But before I want to talk a little bit about Chenin Blanc, because it's still one of my favorite
Oh,
wines.
it's a fabulous wine, but it's sort of unfair because they don't even have it with them.
Well, go out and buy it then. Chenin Blanc is another Loire Valley varietal. And my friend Fred Eck, who taught the course that I took in wine appreciation in 1969, used to be the American representative for a French vintner called Jean Baumard, Domaine Baumard in Rochefort-sur-Loire. And he makes his primarily white grape is Chenin Blanc, and we kind of patterned our Chenin Blanc after his style, which again, no oak aging. Jean has been here several times. We actually, the summer of '75, had a house exchange where he was going to come here for a month, and Kim and my younger daughter and my wife, we spent a month in France at Jean's house, and just kind of re-cemented our love for Chenin Blanc. And it's interesting, Chenin Blanc used to be the main white varietal grape grown in California. Charles Krug and Robert Mondavi used to make hundreds of thousands of cases of Chenin Blanc, and now they don't make it any longer. I think we are probably the largest producer of Chenin Blanc left in Northern California.
Well, and a lot of those Chenins were made in a very sweet sort of style and very cloying, and I think that's why they kind of fell out of favor. Plus, they were planted in maybe the wrong regions, but our Chenin has always been a dry style, so it's usually about 0.4% residual sugar, which is really below the threshold of perception. So it drinks dry. It's very refreshing. And you can find it I know it's available in Massachusetts, and I know there's a lot of people on this call from California, so you can find it in California and should be able to find it in some other states where there's a good wine shop. But anyway, back to the Mariner. So one of the things I just wanted to add as we were sort of, let's just be honest, it's really hard as a family business to take over from the first generation to the second generation, right? And not
hard to hand it over too.
It's really hard. Let's just be honest. And Dad was such a pioneer, especially with the white wines, very much so. But I really felt, and my husband really felt, we had an opportunity with our red wine program to really bring it to a whole new level of quality. And it took a lot of hard work. I mentioned we started with the vineyards, and then we started with hiring a new winemaker, a terrific winemaker, and investing lots and lots of money in the right equipment and the right barrels and all of that sort of thing. But this wine for me, the Mariner, the 2017 Mariner, is very much symbolic of going, of the shift. And I happen to be very proud of it. We call it the Mariner, again, a nod to our passion for sailing. It was inspired by a Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem that I fell in love with. And for those of you New Englanders, he's a New England poet. But anyway, the very first vintage was 2004. And I'll never forget when we released that vintage. It was really a big step up for us. And so this is a wine that every year reflects the very best blend, if you will, the very best, most artistic blend of the year. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term meritage, and maybe this is redundant, but I think it's important to explain it in case you're not familiar. So this is considered a classic meritage. It's not pronounced meritage. Most people like to say meritage because it makes it sound fancier, but it's actually a meritage. And meritage is a name, it's a fictitious name that was made up to classify wines blended in the Bordeaux tradition. And so Dad and our winery were very much advocates of the art of Bordeaux blending. In fact, I don't think we've ever produced a 100% Cabernet. And when Dad was making the wines in the early 70s, they were always a blend. And so as the California wine industry evolved and winemakers were making these beautiful blends, they were finding it hard to sell because they were having to market them as table wine. So when you have less than 75% of a single varietal in a wine, the TTB requires that it be called table wine. And so our industry, and there were 6 vintners that got together, Dad, Dave Stair being one of them, they ran a contest to come up with a synonym or a classification, if you will, for wines blended in the Bordeaux tradition. And they chose the term meritage, and it combined the words merit with heritage. And so I had just come back to work here at the winery, and 1985 was our first vintage. And I remember saying to Dad, "Hey, Dad, we should relabel this vintage and call it meritage." And so we were actually the very first winery to use the term meritage on a label, and we completely.
Interesting. The initial term chosen by the group of wineries that wanted to do this Bordeaux blending was élevage. And we were all set to call the wines élevage until someone said, "Hey, wait a minute, guys. Élevage is a French word having something to do with sheep breeding." Well, we decided that wasn't a good analogy, so we chose the term meritage, wines of merit, made in the heritage of Bordeaux.
Right. And so we're very much leaders in the meritage, movement or art of Bordeaux blending, if you will. This particular vintage, so this is a new vintage, 2017. Cabernet Sauvignon takes the lead at 69% Cabernet, with about 15% Merlot, and then a little bit of Malbec and Petit Verdot, I think equal amounts, 5%, and then 6% Cabernet Franc. So, conceptually, the idea with a meritage wine is that every year the blend will change depending on the harvest conditions and what Mother Nature gives you. So in a year where Cabernet Sauvignon is extremely, let's say, very tannic, we'll blend in more Merlot or a little more Cabernet Franc, or let's say the Cabernet that year tends to be just lighter in color. We'll blend in a little bit more Petit Verdot, which is a very dark, inky, deeply colored variety. And so what's really fun about our Mariner is that the blend changes every year. We do tend to have it be more Cabernet driven. That's kind of become a house style for us. But the blend does change every year, and it very much reflects the vineyard sites. And so if you get back to some of those earlier slides where we're picking, these are our Cabernet grapes are grown at the higher elevation, kind of more mountainous, rugged terrain in that bright red high iron content soil. You get sort of, that translates for me anyway, into some very deep, sort of dark. I mean, to me, this is really like deeply dark kind of cassis, maybe black currant, sort of black raspberry. And I'm getting a little bit of a dark chocolate or cocoa kind of essence. And again, a little bit of a dried herbs or spices, if you will, maybe a little coriander or sage. And there's a little bit of nice cedar. So this is one of our finest red wines that we produce. One of the wines that I would say ages beautifully. And in 2017, I was actually asking our winemaker, Tim Bell, just a little bit before this call to help refresh my memory about the vintages, because I've been here for, 34 years now. So the vintages start to run together. But 2017 was actually a really hot vintage. And I don't know if you remember, Dad, but we had that heat spell at the end of August. It was like 5 days of really intense heat. And what's interesting is the alcohol is only 14.2%. So that shows you how diligently Tim and our harvest and production crew worked to make sure that things were getting harvested and, on time and not being left to get overripe. They managed that very, very well. But because of the warmer vintage, it's a very big and bold wine. This particular photograph that's on the slide or on your screen now is a photograph of our Endeavor Vineyard. We call this the Endeavor Vineyard, which again, kind of goes back to when Dawn and I were first taking over, and we had this big grand dream to produce these world-class wines. And hence we named it the Endeavor Vineyard, because it was our greatest endeavor. And we actually produce a Cabernet Sauvignon called Endeavor Cabernet. So this wine is a blend of several different vineyards from different sites within Dry Creek Valley. But I think it's a great example of just a classic Bordeaux blend. It's big, it's brooding, but it's got great acidity and it's got, quite moderate alcohol.
One of my major complaints, I think, of a lot of California wineries is tendency towards excessive alcohol. Quite often you see Cabernets in the 15 to 15.5%, 16% range. That's just, I think, too alcoholic for my taste.
Well, and we're so lucky here in Dry Creek Valley because, again, that fog influence is really plays a major role.
Yes, it does.
Areas, Central Valley, of course, Lodi, even parts of Napa, even Alexander Valley, which is quite a bit warmer. They don't have that that influence of the marine layer.
Ken, maybe I could jump in with a question here, kind of along the lines of terroir. A number of folks have asked, how have the past year's droughts and wildfires affected the wines this year and in other vintages?
Well, there's okay. I'll answer that, and I'm sure Dad has a different answer because he was very directly impacted by the fire. So, the 2017 fire did not impact Dry Creek Vineyard. All of our vineyards are here in Dry Creek Valley, and none of our growers were impacted. Sadly, it impacted Dad directly because he lost his house, and that was a real tragedy. So 2017 fires really didn't affect the winery. Last year's fires were obviously very difficult. They were not close to the winery. They were in those, a very kind of rural area west of here in those mountains that go towards the coast. So, it wasn't near the winery. It wasn't near our vineyards. Nonetheless, it was very frightening. And for the first week or two, we kept a very close eye. We were all evacuated. The winery was shut down with the exception we were in the middle of harvest. And so I had to obtain special permits from the county so that, so that Tim and the winemaking crew could come in. And just to give you kind of an example, I think the fires were maybe, 3-4 miles away. We were very closely watching the wind, obviously. But what was interesting is there really wasn't any smoke on the valley floor. And we sort of thought we were out of the woodwork. Well, then the smoke started to kind of come. And by that time you had all these other areas in the state, burning as well. And so what we ended up doing is it was an extraordinary feat. So we ended up making over 100 different tiny micro ferments, basically 5-gallon buckets with grapes fermenting that we sent to labs. And we had to basically test for any potential smoke impact. It was arduous. And I'm telling you, our production team, and Sarah knows, she was here too. I mean, it was insane. But we ended up having to reject a good part of our Cabernet, or what would have become our 2020 Cabernet. We had to reject some of the 2020 Zinfandel. The whites were by and large already harvested and unaffected. And I can tell you, having tasted our 2020 Chenin, our 2020 Sauvignon Blanc, and I just approved the 2020 Petite Zin Rosé, they're phenomenal. The good news is that we hadn't blended yet our 2019 reds. And so we're going to make a very small amount of really nice 2020 reds, but it's going to be a tiny vintage, whereas the 2019, which was a very abundant vintage, will carry us through. That's probably more than you wanted to know about the fire, but that's the fire. Water is a real concern. We have one vineyard that has a pond that we collect all the rainwater naturally, and it's low, and it was low last year, and so there is some concern about water. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Dad.
No, I think you summed it up.
I think here's the good news from a consumer standpoint. You should be confident that what you see on the shelves from the 2020 vintage from a really reputable winery from Dry Creek will be great, because there's not a single high quality winery like us that's going to allow something to be bottled that has any impact of smoke. And we've done so many tests, and we continue to do tests. I mean, that's become like something that we didn't even know really how to do, and now we've become experts on it. And I hope to God we never have to do it ever again. Yeah, I hope I answered that.
I think you did.
Another thing I'll just say for anybody who might be eventually considering a trip out here, you would never know the fire even happened. It wasn't on like all the slides that we've been showing. was nowhere near those areas. It's not on the valley floor. It's not on the side, on the benchlands or hillsides. It really is stunningly beautiful. And so, you know, that's, I guess, the blessing, is that the vast majority of the area that burned was, you know, uninhabited, very rural, you know, mountainous forest land, basically. And it's from years and years and years of no forest management and, you know, and other reasons.
Along those lines too, a number of folks are asking, what portion of the grapes that you use do you grow yourselves?
Oh, yeah, good question. So it's about 40%. And then we work with a lot of small local growers. Many of these growers, what's so awesome, and you know, this is what makes me just, you know, it makes it very heartwarming for me. A lot of our growers are growers that Dad worked with when he, you know, in the 70s and 80s. In fact, I would say at least 75% of our growers, and we probably have, I don't know, 20, 25 different growers, maybe 20 growers. They're the same ones that Dad worked with. So we're talking multi-generational families, and we feel so blessed with, you know, those relationships. And unfortunately, and I know you would agree, Dad, probably your biggest mistake is you didn't buy more vineyard land here when it was cheap.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Well, I don't know about you, but I know you guys are probably either having your dinner or had your dinner, but we have not. And I'm starting to have thoughts of lamb chops or like a really nice porterhouse or some kind of a nice, maybe a good New York steak. I just feel like that.
Dinner served.
What's that?
When are you serving dinner? I'll be over.
Okay. Any other particular questions? Beef bourguignon, I'll take some of that. That sounds delicious.
Yes.
One more here. This is more of a general question. What is your view on corks versus screw tops?
Good question. Good question. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, being in Washington, D.C., you know, which has a number of very good wine shops, and seeing a rack of New Zealand wines, all with screw caps. And ended up buying a couple of them, and then bringing the brochure home and showed it to Kim. And Kim said, "Dad, we're not going to use screw caps. It's beneath our quality."
Gauche.
What?
I said it's gauche.
Okay. And anyways, so we didn't. But 3 or 4 years later, she said, "You know, maybe we ought to try screw caps. I mean, we're heavily trying to go after the wine by the glass business in restaurants, and restaurateurs like something they can open quickly, and a screw cap fits the bowl, so fit the ball. So basically, I think we bought 1 year about half our Chenin Blanc in screw caps, and had no complaints. And then I think eventually we bought all of our Chenin Blanc, and now I think all of our Fumé Blanc is in screw caps.
Exactly. Pretty much the 3 signature white wines are all in screw caps. I don't use screw caps for any of the reds, and that's because, you know, it's unknown how it will affect the aging process, right? And that's the main reason. You know, every winery has a little bit of a different philosophy. But for wines that are meant to be consumed when they're really fresh and fruity and young, like our Fumé Blanc or our dry Chenin Blanc, I think a screw cap's perfect.
Yes.
You know what might be fun is to show some pictures of the winery today, maybe take you on a little tour. So I don't know if you have those slides queued up, Sarah. That might be fun. So okay, great. So this is, so Dad, when he built the winery, and obviously it was one building, and now we've added on over the years.
The original building. The building on the left is the original building.
Right. And the building that's straight ahead with the lanterns on it, that's actually our tasting room. And my office where I'm sitting is just sort of off the screen on the right. But the winery was patterned after that kind of French Loire Valley chateau style. So very traditional. We have a beautiful picnic area. We're one of the most popular picnic destinations in the summertime. And in fact, right now we're open to the public by appointment, all outside. So people are starting, as the weather gets nice, starting to bring their picnics and whatnot. we also have a really pretty, I mentioned the Insectary Garden. I don't know if we have that to show, but that's a really lovely area. And we have a kind of a self-guided vineyard walk for people to learn about the history of Dry Creek Valley. And we didn't really talk too much about it, but you know, the Italians did settle here in the late 1800s, and they did plant grapes. And actually there was a very vibrant wine growing industry or wine industry prior to Prohibition. It was Prohibition that wiped that out and converted everything to prunes. And then, you know, prunes were planted for, I guess, the 30 or 40 years prior to when Dad arrived. But anyway, this is directly kind of in front of the main parking lot. In fact, this photograph is where that groundbreaking photo that we showed earlier. So, and then just on the other side of the insectary is one of our, actually two of our most famous vineyards, both Zinfandel. One is a head pruned, dry farmed Zinfandel vineyard. That's a newer vineyard, but it was planted in the same style as a vineyard that was planted 100 years ago. And that is part of our commitment to old vine Zinfandel. And then we also have our heritage vine Zinfandel vineyard, again, just on the other side of this sort of insectary area. And then this is in our cellar. One of the things that, you know, people are always amazed at that, like, we do everything here on site. It's a real working winery. We, you know, grow the grapes, we make the wine, we sell the wine, we pour wine for people, and it's all done here on site. We don't store anything off site. So this is the original main cellar that today still stores many barrels. In fact, that little door on the right-hand corner is our winemaker's office. And then we also pour wines in the cellar for people. So it's a really lovely experience. I would encourage anybody coming out here to come and visit us. We'd love to see you.
That building was built in '73, and that summer or fall after it was built, it was virtually empty, and we ended up stretching a clothesline across and playing tennis in there one winter until we got barrels to fill it up. But that's the original winery building.
And I remember so Mom and Dad, you know, before they actually opened the tasting room, they were here every weekend, and I was often in tow. And I remember sitting on the floor of the cellar with my dolls and, you know, Barbies and all of that, and just sitting and waiting for them to get done with whatever they would do. And if you happen to come by and bang on those cellar doors there, they might open the door and open a bottle of wine and, you know, pour a bottle of wine for you, because that was pre-tasting room days.
Our tasting room consisted of 2 barrels and a plank.
Yeah. And that saying, "We've come a long way, baby," is very apropos. And then this is a photograph of my children, the next generation, my husband and my daughter, Taylor and Spencer. They are currently living their dreams, living in Montana. My son is a fly fishing guide and a college student, and my daughter works in digital marketing and just moved to Bozeman. And I keep keeping my fingers crossed that they're going to grow tired of that cold and recognize how fabulous it is here. But I think they will eventually.
Taylor and Dylan, her fiance, have been up there, for about a month now?
Yep.
And the first 10 days or so they were there, I think the high was -10.
Yeah.
And I remember calling Taylor up one day and saying, "How's it going?" She said, "It's colder than the devil." And
yeah.
you go outside, and after about 30 seconds, you got to come back inside to warm up.
Yep. So that's number one question for Dry Creek is, why are there sailboats on the label? And the number 2 question I get asked is there another generation? So
hopefully so.
Hopefully so. So Kevin, what we needed more wines. We needed a Zinfandel. We needed some more wines to taste.
Well, I'm sure there's plenty left in the bottles to continue tasting for a few more minutes here with some.
You know, it's hard for me to read the chat at the same time, but I saw somebody asking about, I think it was a question about climate. Has the climate changed, or something about the fog? Has it changed? I don't know exactly how it was worded, but this is kind of interesting. I had a similar, you know, question myself, and we actually, I did a little study of all the basically the harvest dates going back 20, 25 years to see whether the harvest dates have gotten earlier. And it's interesting. You would think, right, that with global warming that they have, and we didn't. The answer is no. We are still picking at about, you know, the first grapes we usually bring in are usually end of August, maybe the 3rd or 4th week of August. And we usually wrap up by the mid to end of October, which is, as long as I can remember, that's how it's always been. I think our bigger environmental concerns have to do with water, to be honest.
I'm reading some of the questions.
Oh, somebody picked up a couple of Zinfandels. Well, that was smart.
We've got some coming through on the portal here. Dave, I think this was a question for you when you gave your self-intro. They said, this is very interesting, but to back up, did you need the organic chemistry? So I think...
yes and no. As we grew, we hired our first winemaker in 1975, John Jaffrey. And John essentially made the wines for about 6 years, then went to work for Winty Brothers. But I made the decision in about 75 or 76 to concentrate more on the actual running of a business and not the winemaking. So John took over that, and then we had a winemaker, Larry Levine, for about 20 years, who was with us through the 80s and the 90s. And our current winemaker, Tim Bell, has been with us, what now, 7 or 8 years?
10 years this harvest. 10 years this harvest.
For the first 2 or 3 years, I could do everything myself. And then I realized I had to start delegating, and I decided to go more into the business aspect of the business rather than the production winemaking aspect. But at one time I drove tractor and planted vineyards and racked wines and ran a bottling line and all that kind of good stuff.
I love the idea of you reading a textbook while you're harvesting, while you're trying to figure out how to make that first vintage.
Fortunately, Tom Trell and Fred Brander and Tom Dellier were around to help.
Yeah, so we have got to remember to invite them to our 50th anniversary next year. Big, that's super important. Everybody should take organic chemistry. Oh, golly, I think I would have flunked it if I had taken it.
Well, it was by far the hardest course I ever took. And I'm not so sure if it's just the subject matter or having to go to BU every day during the summer when it was 95 degrees in their buildings. They weren't air conditioned at the time.
I see a question here that is about talking about the difference between the different single vineyard Zinfandels and they love the Wallace. Well, thank you. Love the Wallace. That's actually the wine that we produce from our vineyard, which is just next door. It would be really hard to do that in a short period of time. But basically what we're trying to do with our single vineyard Zinfandels is express the unique location or the unique site. And what happened was, we've been making wine for, oh my gosh, at least 30 years and started to realize that every vineyard has, a slightly different expression. Not every vineyard, but, the idea of making single vineyards wines, to me, requires decades, if not centuries of experience. And that's how they've done it in France, right? Why is one domain, one vineyard completely different than another one, a half a mile away? So our whole single vineyard program was born out of the notion that we wanted to produce wines that express the terroir of Dry Creek Valley in these kind of site-specific locales, I guess. We produce a single vineyard Zinfandel from a 120, actually almost 140-year-old vineyard, pre-Prohibition vineyard that's incredibly dark and spicy and peppery, and it's, dry farmed head pruned vines. And then the Wallace Ranch, which is the one that this person was speaking about, is a vineyard that my husband and I planted in 1990 using kind of this heritage clone propagation technique where we took budwood from a pre-Prohibition vineyard, grafted that onto rootstock that we planted in our new vineyard. The idea was we were trying to kind of replicate some of the characteristics of old vines in a new young planting. And so that vineyard now is about 30 years old or whatever that is. Is a little bit brighter fruit, a little nice acidity, some nice spiciness, but each single vineyard expression is truly an expression of the site, how it's farmed, where it's farmed. Is it, what kind of trellising system? Is it head pruned? Is it contemporary trellising? And so that's what we're trying to do with those. And the best way to taste them is to taste them all side by side.
Yes.
Another question from the audience. You mentioned the effect early on in your career of a positive review. How important are reviews from publications like Wine Spectator, and how do you kind of go about trying to get those reviews?
Well, it's very different than I think.
They're very important.
They're very, very, very important. And wildly important. We essentially send samples in to the major publications, and they blind taste everything and rate the wines. This is probably, Sarah, I didn't realize you were going to show that. This is probably the single most exciting thing that I think has happened in a long time, and that is that, you know, I'm on the cover of Wine Spectator with my dog Holly, and that we're included in this story that Wine Spectator did. And you know, it's taken years and years of rebuilding and re-engineering and really raising the quality of the wines so that we are consistently getting 90s and above in Wine Spectator, and we're on their radar. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, and I'm really proud of that. You know, that's a reflection of the last, you know, this sort of the makeover, if you will, the winery makeover over the last 10 years or so. And we incidentally also we were selected to be in their top 100 for two of our Zinfandels now, 2 years in a row. This year was for the Spencer's Hill Zinfandel, the only Zinfandel to make the Wine Spectator top 100 list. And last year was the Heritage Vine Zinfandel. And so these are huge accomplishments, and it's taken literally a lifetime to do this, you know, and so the scores are important.
Is it your picture or Holly's picture that made the front cover?
I think it's Holly's tongue, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, it looks like from the print down below that's coming out now.
It's the March 31st issue. It's on the newsstands, and it's actually a really charming issue because it features all these different people with their dogs, and I think their intention was to have kind of a feel-good story during, you know, these times with COVID and all the stress that people are under. So I was just delighted. I had no idea that I was going to be on the cover until about a week. I guess it's probably been a week and a half ago when I got a text from the writer who interviewed me back in October, and he sent me a picture, and I'm still pinching myself.
Who took the picture, Kim?
Well, that is a great story. So my daughter's fiance, Dylan, the one that just moved to Bozeman, Montana, is a photographer, and I got interviewed for this article, and then they asked us if we had any photographs of the dog and me, and I didn't really have any, so I asked Dylan if he could possibly just run over after work one day and take some pictures, very casually. So we did, and we sent them in. Here we go. So
Great picture.
It is a great picture. So Dylan is, of course, as you can imagine, thrilled to be able to add that to his portfolio.
Dave, given your MIT background, we have a question here. As engineers, we're interested in the process variables in winemaking. What are the primary ways that you make your mark in turning grapes into a fine fermented beverage from a process standpoint?
Oh boy.
Maybe top couple of them.
I've been out of the winemaking aspect for 25 years, but basically you have to start with good grapes, good equipment, and basically make no mistakes. It's that's not a very good answer, but I'm not quite sure how to answer it.
Well, there's just so many variables, you know, what kinds of yeast you're using. Obviously the location of a vineyard, how it was farmed. If a vineyard if it's too much shade, for Sauvignon Blanc, for example, if there's not enough sunlight on the fruit and it's very shaded canopy, lots of leaves, the Sauvignon Blanc can get very green and grassy and herbal and sort of not, you know, it goes in that direction. That I don't know if that would be considered. I mean, it's a variable. So we actively do leaf thinning. Oh my gosh, there's just so many little things that we do to help get the outcome that we want. That's a great question, but I think the answer is too big for us to even remember all the things.
Yeah.
Sarah, did anything pop into your brain?
Yeah, I mean, there's all different things, you know.
Barrels.
Yeah, barrels. There's fermentation techniques. We do a lot of co-fermentation. So, for example, Zinfandel loses a lot of color in the fermentation process. So what we'll do is we'll take the Zinfandel grapes after we've fermented them and press them on top of Petite Syrah skins so that we get some extra structure and color to that. So there's a lot of different little things that we can do to really kind of just bring out the best of the grapes.
Right.
Do you strive for consistency then from year to year, or do you kind of let each?
No, absolutely consistency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unless we can make it better.
What's that?
I said, unless we can make it better, your no compromises philosophy that you have.
Right. Yeah. You know, one of the things I guess I maybe didn't mention, but so we're a mid-sized family-owned winery, but we produce wine in a very small lot, small winery way. And we do that by, like each vineyard, sometimes we're picking several sites within or blocks within blocks of vineyards separately. Tim will walk these vineyards during harvest and identify which section he wants planted. I mean, and then within the winery, there are, blocks are split up and barrel aged in different types of barrels for different periods of time. We are, one of the things that's happening with wineries of our size, et cetera, is that they're starting to go to the California appellation. They're sourcing fruit from the broader appellation of either the north coast of California, which would mean here north, which means Mendocino, Lake County, or the broader appellation of California. And they do that to lower their input costs, right? To lower their cost of goods sold. And what happens is you're getting a much more homogeneous, not so much a site-specific or terroir-driven approach. And as Sarah and my whole team knows, my mantra is no compromises. So we have bucked that trend of wineries like us by really focusing in on the right, first of all, the right grapes planted on the right site, in the right region, farmed in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. And this Fumé Blanc, I would challenge anybody on this call, go to the store and look at Fumé Blancs in the same price category, and probably the vast majority will be a California appellated wine, and it will not be as nice and as distinctive and as special and as refreshing. And so that's why the wines are getting such great scores, because they're great quality wines made, in a really passionate manner.
Every winery that I know of that has been bought by every small family winery has been bought by a larger winery or wine corporation, invariably the quality of their wines gets dumbed down. They switch from a Sonoma County appellation to a California appellation.
It's happening every time.
I just had tasted a wine from a winery. I won't mention the name of the winery. It used to make very good wines, and it used to be owned by friends, and now the wine is frankly crap. Well,
and I think the other thing is, my management style with our winemaker is to allow him to have the freedom to make the best wines of his career. That's why we hired him. If I thought I could do a better job, I would be the winemaker. I couldn't. I definitely couldn't.
Well, I'm going to argue.
I never took organic chemistry, but more importantly, I let Tim make his wines or make the wines without interfering. I don't tell him what barrels to produce. I don't force him to buy these grapes or that grape or use this yeast or this technique because it's less expensive. We have a joke around here that we don't allow our CFO in the cellar, and what happens, and I've had many winemaker friends who work for wineries that get purchased. Pretty soon that winemaker is being forced to use the same barrels as all the other winemakers at all the other wineries that the big mothership owns. So again, that's kind of the dumbing down of the California wine industry, and we are absolutely fighting that tooth and nail, and I think that's why we stand out.
Well, I want to comment briefly on what you said, Kim, about consistency. I would have said that we do not make our wines consistent. We're trying to make them consistently
stylistically.
Vintage, but each vintage is going to be a little bit different because there's virtually no inter-vintage blending, and at a big winery, they want their Zinfandel to taste the same every year after year, and we want ours to be the best from a given year.
Well, and I think maybe what I should have said is stylistically, we're trying to be consistent. So there's a hallmark style with our wines, and you probably picked it up with these two wines, which could not be more different, right? But they both have one thing in common: bright acidity, abundant fruit. We're very much a winery that does not like overripe, high alcohol wines. We like moderate alcohol. We try to produce wines that are food friendly, that age well, and that requires, that level of acidity and liveliness. And so those are kind of hallmarks of the winery that, I think we've managed to maintain for 5 decades.
When you buy a Zinfandel or a Cabernet that's 16% alcohol, it's just too alcoholic to enjoy with food, I think.
After we tasted the Fumé Blanc, there was a comment, this is delicious. I bet it tastes different in California today than in Massachusetts with the snow we have on the ground right now. I'd love to hear anything about how flavors and aromas change by the location in which you're enjoying it and by the time of year in which it's consumed.
Wow. I don't think I've ever been asked that, ever.
Well, I from my 2 years of living in Germany, nothing tastes better than a nice glass of Rhine wine as you're overlooking the Rhine River. And it tastes better there than it tastes here.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure how to answer that. Yeah.
I guess we'll just have to go out to your vineyard and try it there and then come back to Massachusetts and try
Yeah.
it.
I don't know how to answer that. I saw a question pop up about something about big companies using additives and things. And I thought people might be interested in the new Fumé Blanc label, Sarah, and I could kind of walk them through that. So one of the recent developments that we've had here is we relabeled our Fumé Blanc in this new label that is kind of bold for us. Of course, it keeps with our nautical theme, with the sailboat, but we added this panel of text to really showcase the authenticity of our wines, because people often think that we're bigger than we are, and they kind of, we felt that we were missing an opportunity to better communicate the fact that we really have nothing to hide. And so these different panels on the label speak to the biodiversity of our vineyards. They speak to the fact that the grapes are grown in our own estate vineyards and small local family farms. There's a little bit of information on the flavor profile. We talk about how the wine is, non-oak aged, stainless steel fermented. And I even put in a little panel about sort of the wellness details, addressing some people's concerns about gluten, the fact that it's gluten-free, vegan, with minimal intervention. And so, that notion of minimal intervention is very important to us. We don't use mega purple. We don't add any foaming aid. There's all kinds of weird things that I guess wineries are doing. And in fact, I don't even know what they are, because sometimes I get asked these things. I have never heard of them. I go to my winemaker, Tim. He says, I've never even heard of that. So I think there's sort of a different, there's different ways of making wine, but the way that we make wine is authentic, quality driven, trying to express, that grape, the grape and the best that the vineyard has. That's kind of what we're all about.
Well said.
So I have a feeling that we should be getting close to the breakout groups, right?
Yes, ma'am. We have a few more questions in the portal, but I think we'll leave those. I will be sending out an email after the event with Sarah's contact. So if folks didn't get the question answered tonight, they're welcome to ask her, and Dave will also be staying afterwards for the after party.
And one thing I would be remiss in doing this, first of all, thank you, everybody. I just wanted to make a little offer to everybody. If we've enticed you with our wines, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. We have that beautiful dry Chenin. We've got a number of amazing single vineyard Sauvignon Blancs and Zinfandels, and then we haven't even talked about it, but we produce a number of wines in our terroir series labels that are different meritage blends from different districts in the valley. So anyway, there's a lot more to taste from Dry Creek. And so we wanted to offer you a $1 shipping offer for any wines from the winery for the rest of the month. So till the end of March, basically March 31st. And I know shipping is often the cost of shipping is often a factor when buying wines directly from wineries. So we wanted to eliminate that and hopefully entice you to try more of our wines. And so you can find them on our website.
And if you can also email us if you want, and I think we can tell you the address or the address and name and address and locations of various wine shops in your area if you want to know where to buy the wines.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, Sarah's telling me, please use, okay, this is the beauty of Zoom. If you do place an order online, use the code MIT. So easy to remember, MIT, $1 shipping.
Thank you for doing that for us.
You're welcome.
I know.
So I'm really hoping that there's some other wines that people can taste because they're all delicious. I know somebody on this call was drinking the Wallace Zinfandel, which is of course a favorite of mine, but they're all really delicious.
One of the things that I've started doing recently is I've joined a group of about 12 or 13 MIT guys from the classes of 61 through 64. We're all members of the DU fraternity house, which is where I was a member. And we sent out an email to all of those guys telling them about the tasting. And we meet next Tuesday. So if you're on the call, I'll see you guys next Tuesday at 11.
Sounds good.
That's great. Well, yeah, Kim, Dave, Sarah, thank you so much. Kim, I know you need to take off.
I do. I have to be there somewhere by 6. So
No problem. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I really love the family aspect. The tie to MIT is just icing on the cake too. It was a pleasure having you both here.
you are so welcome. Thank you so much. And I'm going to drop off, and I think Dad's going to stay on. Is that right?
I thought I was coming to dinner at your house tonight.
There you go. Well,
Yeah.
I've got to be somewhere, but I'll be done in about an hour, so you can call me.
I'm going home and having dinner with my wife.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you out here someday. Take care.
Bye-bye.
So for those who are interested in staying for the breakouts, we're going to now move to the breakout sessions. Those are really just meant to be conversational and informal, very personal. So you'll be in a room with about 5 or 6 other folks, and we can just talk about what you're tasting, what's going on in life, ties to MIT, really anything that you'd like to discuss. If you're not staying for the breakouts, thank you very much for joining tonight. It's a pleasure to have all of you, and hope we get to see you again at a future event.